All right, here are the supplies you're gonna need. First, you're gonna need some filler primer. Then you're gonna need some drywall compound or spackle. I like this one. Then you're gonna need something to sand with, either sandpaper or sanding sponges in a medium grit and then a fine grit. And this is just a sponge. And these are ribs from a pottery kit, but also a palette knife would work too. So historically, this is like an industrial design process, although this is the similar process that you'd use in other sort of studio art and painting processes. Okay. Historically, this was covered in something called Bondo. Does anybody know what Bondo is? Bondo is automotive body filler, and it's like really toxic. And so I've moved to this stuff because, and it's also a respiratory hazard. I've moved to this stuff because it doesn't have those terrible fumes. And it's mostly water. There's stuff in here besides water, but it's mostly can be thinned with water, cleaned up with water. However, when you're sanding it, it is a little bit of a respiratory hazard. So the little bit that I'm doing right here is not really that big of a deal. However, anytime you're making powders, especially like wood's one thing, and you probably do want to wear a respirator mask if you're going to be around sanding wood. But stuff like this, the particles are even smaller, and they're made out of weirder things. So you know, if you're working on this, you might want to use a mask. Almost everything that you can use to fill this stuff is going to have silica in it. Okay, and silica can be a respiratory hazard, and so I don't want you actually to be sanding the drywall compound on the sanding table, because all that's going to do, because it doesn't have the right kind of filtration in there, so all that's going to do is just spray that into the room, and that's not good for anybody. So one way that you can work with this is you can actually work with it in the spray booth. Sometimes I'll just literally do my sanding in the spray booth and let it take it out. Or you can do it outdoors, or you can just keep it in a little confined area and close it up. The only other thing I'll actually just mention too, with respect to skin hazards, this stuff is not gonna hurt you. It's not a major respiratory hazard. However, it can be irritating. So if you get the dust on your hands, on your arms, you might be like, I don't like how this feels and I feel a little itchy. Make sure to just wash it off periodically or wear long sleeves. Same with breathing it in. And the drywall, it's okay to get a little bit on your fingers. If you don't want to, there's always gloves behind you, but don't leave it on like all day, right? So I'm gonna go wash my hands and wash it off and I'll be fine, but I wouldn't just like have it all over me, if that makes sense. It'll just irritate your skin. This doesn't actually take that much time in terms of each individual little bit. If you added it all up, it would take you a little bit of time, but a lot of it's waiting for stuff to dry, right? And this is a pretty easy shape, right? Like I can just take my block and drag it along the table. Of course, if you had a more complicated form, like let's say you were trying to fill in something like this, it actually might be harder for you to do that because you've got to get into little interior contours and you've got to like deal with this little bevel on here. And so there are forms that are harder to do this process to, but this is not one of them. So first I'm going to get the big grooves, maybe saw marks out using the lower grit sandpaper. And I'll use the table as a block, and then I go back with the finer grit sandpaper. Now after I do it, not all the little marks are going to come out of it, so it's sort of a sweet spot. You'll see on this one, there's a little mark that's going to have to be filled in later. Now I get my fill primer and I shake it up a lot. When I spray, I want to use a lot of light coats and I want to keep my arm moving, and I want to rotate using these turntables, the thing that I'm spraying, so that I'm getting really even coverage. I don't want to have any drips. So this is what it's going to look like after one coat. Now you can check your can for your dry times. And then once it's time, you go back and shake it up again and put another coat on. And so you're going to use that same technique with the moving your hand, rotating the object, light, even coats, no drips. Same thing, just repeating yourself over again. Here's what it looks like after 2 coats. So you'll see that it's building up a little bit, but there's still some areas where it's not filled in. So after 2 coats, you can go back in and do a little bit of sanding. So this is with the coarser grit sandpaper still. And I use the sanding block to make sure that I'm not losing my shape. But you'll see that the dust actually starts to fill in the little holes. And that's a good thing. So you don't need to blow off the object to get the dust off of it. In fact, you want to use that to your advantage. All right, now I'm going to go in for a 3rd coat after I've done some sanding. And I always shake up, remember, and I'm going to use that same technique yet again. But now I've got a little bit of that dust in those pores, and so what I should see is that it's filling in even more. Even so, there's still a little bit left. So same kind of thing, right? And I would do the sides too, right? I come through each of these sides. But then it starts to get substantially smoother, but it's still not quite enough, okay? Like it's still not quite where we want it to be. And so how do we deal with that? Well, we're gonna take our drywall compound. And what we're gonna do is, do you remember how I talked about having one of these things at the beginning of the semester? This is where this is going to come in handy. I'm going to take my clean pottery rib here, and I'm just going to take some of this drywall compound, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start smearing it all over the surface here. Smooth it on, right? I fill in places that are just like a little bit deeper, that are not being effectively filled in with that filler primer. So do you see that? See how it's like filling into those little bits? I can also use my rib to extend corners that might have gotten dented in using the drywall compound as well. And when it dries, unlike something like Bondo, which is like a sort of a thermoset type of material, you can actually take things like a sponge and you can wipe it back, right? So, whereas if I put like something that's hard, like automatic body filler like Bondo on there, I actually can decide not to use that, and I could just remove it subtractively. Okay, so this is just like a little wet sponge. You can also use something like this if that gives you a little bit more control, right? You can take a wet sponge and wet it, and then remove it with a dry sponge, right? So you don't have to be sanding all the time. And then, let's say I did that. You start to do the same thing again that you did before. You take your fine grit sandpaper, and then you just sand this back as well. Same thing. But you can feel that surface getting a lot smoother. So the process goes like this. You just sort of alternate until such time that you put on a coat of paint and it looks gorgeous, right? And the white stuff always has to be top coated with the primer, because if you put paint on this, it would just dissolve. But it brings up an important point. Let's say I was making a model of a pot, like a teapot. And let's say I had a lid that went inside the teapot, and I went and painted both the teapot and the lid. This does add a little bit of thickness, a little bit of it's got some dimension. And so it might make it so that two parts that are meant to fit together would not fit together as well. So it's the kind of thing you want to plan for a little bit. The other thing I'll just mention is that at every stage, you need to make sure that you're preserving your shape, if that makes sense. So like, I would not go like real heavy on everything and then say, I'll just carve the shape back out later. No, every step, make sure you've got your crisp corners, make sure that you've got your surface flat, make sure you've got everything the way it needs to be before you move on to the next stage. That being said, you never want to sand back through to the yellow. If you're sanding back through to the yellow, you're not sanding evenly, and that's not what you want. Okay, so you should, once the yellow is covered, you should never see the yellow again. All right, but I can take this and I can start sanding this. Right, so it's like you can see you're going through the layers. You see like gray, white, gray, white, gray, white. That's an indication of uneven sanding. It's just something to keep in mind. Or it's potentially an indication of uneven deposition of your materials on top of it. But just be aware of the fact that that's going to indicate you're going through layers. And so if you start seeing yourself going through multiple layers, you might be getting to your yellow foam soon. This is a pretty fast process, right? It takes like 10 minutes at a time. You could probably knock out 85% of this in an hour. But you do want to just keep track of your dry times. If it's not drying, like this is already starting to dry up, but if it's not drying up, you can put a hair dryer on it or put it in a warm spot. It'll dry a little faster. So you should finish this little finishing process with a coat of the filler primer.